Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today about properties that are in a pending status. An agreement of purchase and sale is in place. Perhaps it was conditional. The conditions have removed, and now we're waiting for closing. And the closing might be a month, month and a half away. It's amazing how many things can go wrong in that pending period. Had a call the other day. The property was sold, and it was a building inspection was done. And one of the things that came up through the building inspection was there was a leak in the hot water tank. And so the seller agreed to rectify it before closing. Shouldn't be a problem. The seller brought a proper tradesman in, and the tradesman, in playing around with the area that was leaking, snapped it off. Well, all of a sudden, the water all leaked out into the basement from the hot water tank, and the hot water tank couldn't be fixed because this part was snapped off. That's a problem. We've had a lot of rain lately. We had another situation in pending where the property basement leaked. The owner said they have never had a leak in all the years they've owned it, but it leaks now. So the basement is flooded and it's a finished basement. The problem and the question might be, who's responsible when these things crop up after the buyer has made a commitment and the seller is still in possession of the property? On your agreement of purchase and sale, it states all buildings on the property and other things being purchased shall be and remain until completion at the risk of the seller. And so the seller has got a responsibility to maintain the property in the condition it was in when the buyer saw it. So what it means is he's got to rectify the problem. For example, with the hot water tank, he's got to fix the hot water tank, and then he's got to repair any damages, which means where the water flooded out into the basement, he's got to repair that. In the case of a basement flooded, the same thing. He's got to solve the problem, clean up the water and the mess, and then try and find out why it happened and rectify it. They might say, well, do you have a responsibility to tell the buyer? Well, it depends on the nature of the problem. Give me an example. Let's suppose you have a dishwasher in the home. Person's buying it, and they're buying it including the dishwasher. And the dishwasher breaks down, and you call a serviceman. Serviceman comes in, replaces the part, dishwasher's fine. Well, you don't need to tell the buyer that. You're maintaining it in the condition it was in when he saw it. But if the basement flooded, and you cleared up the problem, and then you rectified why the problem came about, you may well want to tell the buyer about that. One of the things I've always used as a rule of thumb is, let's assume a buyer is going to find out from a neighbor about a particular problem. They're never going to be happy if they feel they were kept in the dark. They don't like surprises. So tell them. Tell them what happened. Tell them what was done. And in case, for example, of a roof leak, and it could have damped the insulation, well, they want to make sure that it isn't left wet in there where mold could crop up. So you've got a situation like that. But what about, I had another problem that cropped up this last week. An agent called me and he said, I'm selling a property, it's vacant, and the seller tells me he's selling it as is. And oh, by the way, he said there's no insurance on the property. Is that a problem? Well, it could be. The question is, what would happen if the house burned down before closing? And you know, I don't know if you know this or not, but in that same number 14 insurance clause in the agreement of purchase and sale, it actually addresses that. Let me tell you what it says. It says, seller shall hold all insurance policies, if any, so there may not be one, and the proceeds thereof in trust for the parties as their interest may appear, and in the event of substantial damage, the buyer may either terminate the agreement and have all monies paid returned without interest or deduction, or else take the proceeds of the insurance and complete the purchase. Some years ago, had a Victorian farmhouse, and old 100 and some odd year old farmhouse, and between the time the deal was put together and the time of closing, the property burned to the ground. Well, it turned out that the seller did have insurance, and the insurance was replacement insurance. And so after some duking it out with the insurance company, that's never fun, the insurance company agreed to rebuild the farmhouse exactly the way it was, but obviously to today's standards. They have to maintain today's standards. So whereas it might have been 60 amp service, now it's going to be 100 or 200 amp service. The bedrooms may not have had closets, may have knob and tube wiring. All these things are going to be brought up to code. If it's got substantial wood baseboards, it's going to have substantial wood baseboards. If it's got hardwood flooring, it's going to have hardwood flooring. But it's going to be not 125 years old. It's going to be brand new. Can you imagine the cost it would be to replicate what was there at today's standard? And yet that's what the insurance company did. So the seller said, you know what? I've decided I'm not going to go through with the process, with the transaction. I'm just going to keep the house. The buyer said, no, I don't think so. We're going to complete the transaction, and I'm going to move into the new house. And that's exactly what he did, because that's what the clause number 14 gave him the right to do. What about the example I already referenced? What about the fact there isn't any insurance? Well, in that case, the buyer has the option of walking away, and the seller's left with smoking ruins. I want you to mention one other thing before we're done here, and that's this question of final walkthrough. I mean, we've become much more concerned in including in agreements of purchase and sale multiple subsequent visits after a property is sold. I saw one the other day with 7 subsequent visits before closing. Why in the world anybody would need that is beyond me. But it used to be that there wasn't any subsequent visits, but then we would get a call from the buyer the day or two before closing, and he wanted to access the property. And the seller would say, well, I'm sorry, no, you didn't ask to do that. You can't do that. The lawyers took the position, and rightly so, that the buyer had the right to a final walkthrough. And their argument was this: the buyer has the right to either close the transaction with the proceeds of the insurance or walk away from the deal in case of subsequent or substantial damage. How do we know whether or not there was substantial damage if we don't have a look at the property? And so the buyer would be able to go through, have a look at the property as a final inspection. And at that point, everything needs to be in at least as good a condition as it was in when he entered into an agreement of purchase and sale. The seller doesn't have to make it brand new. He needs to make it at least in good a condition as it was when the buyer saw it and entered into a contract. Hope that makes sense. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. Talk to you again next week.